Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace from the couch. I just wanted to do a short video of the externality problems that we didn't get a chance to go over in class. These are the two free response questions. I know a couple of you had questions about this, and so I figured I'd do like a really short video. One is a negative externality and involves some questions related to Pigouvian subsidies and Pigouvian taxes. And the second question is positive externality. That was the one related to Head Start, the expansion of Head Start, and the role of a subsidy in fixing the positive externality. Okie doke, so we'll roll to the questions. And my daughter is my filmer, so a big shout out for her. Say hi, Dad. Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to do this one question about negative externalities, and then I'll do the second free response question about positive externalities. This is first question related to the SUVs. Clearly they are negative externality. It's problematic because there's emissions, lots of ways in which SUVs could be potentially harmful to a third party, people who are not involved in the transaction. And just to remind you, the AP curriculum and also your textbook will generally look at negative externalities as a supply driven. So you're looking at issues with the data on the supply curve to understand a negative externality, and generally positive externalities are demand driven. There are ways that you can graph consumer driven negative externalities, but for now I'm going to leave that kind of outside of this particular question. So first, in order to do this question, we needed to work with some supply and demand graph, and that's what I would do first. I would actually draw your market for SUVs. This is a private market, and you can have a quantity in the market, and you can note your price in the market, and you could also note on the x-axis that this is generally the good SUVs. And when we look at supply and demand in terms of externalities, we're really looking at the demand curve as the same thing as a marginal benefit curve. Okay, and we've looked at this before, the differences between marginal benefit and marginal cost. Our supply curve is essentially our marginal cost curve. And when it comes to demand, because this is a negative externality, we don't really have a difference in what we would call the marginal private benefit and the marginal social benefit. That is, the person who's like driving the SUV maybe receives some degree of benefit, okay? The issue that we're going to note is in the supply curve, okay? So there's a marginal cost that we've noted that kind of equates the supply curve, but let's assume that that's the marginal private cost curve, okay? So the marginal private cost curve is really representative of, say, Ford that's producing SUVs, okay? And the difference with a negative externality is that we have another cost curve that's representative of our marginal social costs. And so our cost to society of the production of all of these SUVs is really problematic, right? It's really, really high. In fact, if we wanted to, we could actually look at any particular quantity and see the per unit cost of an externality. So for every individual SUV produced, it adds a certain cost to society, and we could actually measure that cost per unit, okay? So this is my issue because the quantity that we get from the marginal social cost curve is what we would really call the true quantity, or the allocatively efficient quantity, socially optimal quantity, if you will. The QSO is much lower than the quantity in the market. So, Ford is overproducing SUVs. This is a problem because we want fewer SUVs and we've got way too many of them. And because Ford isn't recognizing all of the social costs, they're operating only with their own marginal private cost curve. So the quantity in the market is the quantity that's actually being produced. Society would like the quantity that's socially optimal. So inherently, we have a goal to try to fix this particular externality. The question part C suggests, how about a Pigouvian subsidy? Don't worry so much about a Pigouvian subsidy or tax. That particular adjective is just describing a tax or a subsidy that is meant to clear up or fix an externality. generally, taxes and subsidies lend themselves to deadweight loss and inefficiency. The exception is if there is an externality. So if there's an externality and you impose a tax or a subsidy, as long as you're imposing the right one, you have the potential to clear up deadweight loss. And that's what makes it Pigouvian. And just a reminder, a subsidy is always going to shift the supply curve to the right, as long as it's a per unit subsidy. A lump sum subsidy will not shift the supply curve. So in this case, if somebody suggested, well, let's try a subsidy to fix this negative externality, and it's a per unit subsidy, let's see what happens. Well, so we create a supply curve shift to the right. Ford is now going to be in a position to have extra money for the production of every single SUV, and we can kind of call this the supply curve or the marginal private cost curve, and this is now, with the subsidy. And what we notice happens if we ignore the other supply curve and now work with this new market quantity, the market quantity, with the subsidy is a much greater quantity. So the subsidy, as trying to fix the negative externality, is definitely the wrong way to go. The subsidy only creates an additional quantity, so we're further away from the quantity that's socially optimal. Rather than producing fewer SUVs, we've encouraged Ford to produce more of them, right? We've subsidized them, given them money to produce more. The price is lower, more people are going to be buying them, so your equilibrium price has gone down, but your equilibrium quantity has gone up. Very, very problematic way to address this negative externality. Okay, so the better way to go would be to do what Bob suggested. Bob suggests a Pigouvian tax, and Bob would be correct. So if you ignore the subsidy, and by the way, one of the questions did relate to what happens in the subsidy in terms of deadweight loss, it actually would increase, because deadweight loss comes from looking at where your socially optimal quantity is. Your deadweight loss now is going to be giant, right? You have this potential inefficiency because you're producing even farther away now from your socially optimal quantity. Okay, so your deadweight loss, which used to be here, this triangle, like right here, is now going to be even bigger, right? All the way up to, like, I can't even get to it on my paper, it's so big, okay? But if we tax, we actually shift the supply curve in the other direction. And if we were really good and we could actually measure the per unit externality and create a per unit tax of the exact same dollar amount, we could actually shift your marginal private cost curve, slam into your marginal social cost curve, and they would be one and the same. And ultimately then you would have one kind of quantity that was both the market quantity and the socially optimal quantity, because you would shift here and you would be able to see this as a new equilibrium, and that would be the tax. Of course, the tax could shift the supply curve just a little bit, putting us closer to socially optimal. All of those things are feasible, but we like to tax producers when they are producing a good that creates a negative externality. And then lastly, the two last parts of the question, one question asked you to label using A and B the per unit cost of the externality. And you could do this in a variety of places. Generally, the way it's graphed, let's assume that for every individual quantity or every individual SUV that gets produced, there's an additional cost for the additional social cost, the cost that Ford isn't paying, but maybe every additional SUV costs society an additional $24, right? Where would we find that $24? Well, I could pick one quantity, say quantity socially optimal, and I could locate A right here and go all the way up to the marginal social cost curve and label B. Okay, the full gap at one particular quantity between the marginal private cost curve and the marginal social cost curve is where I would find my dollar amount, which I would have to look at my y-axis in order to get the dollar amount using my prices over here. But the difference between, like, B minus A would give me my per unit externality cost. And if I wanted to, I could also find that anywhere, between these two lines. So A and B, A and B, A and B, as long as I'm doing it at a particular quantity, okay? Some of you guys labeled A here and B here, and that's not correct, because we're not looking at per unit costs ever going across your quantity axis. It has to be per unit, means, at one particular unit. And as long as it's constant, it could be anywhere between these two curves. And of course, if you did want to fix the externality without taxing, sometimes taxing is politically just not feasible. Congress might have to pass a law, and a whole bunch of things can happen to make taxing really challenging. There could be some other ways in which the SUVs could be produced in a smaller weight. Might also require legislation. You could invoke a quota, fine producers that produce too much. You could do a quota. You could do a price, make the prices higher, some sort of price floor. That type of thing could potentially work. So there are other strategies as well. Okie doke, so we'll do positive externalities next. Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace, and I am still on the couch.
You're doing amazing, sweetie.
Thank you much. This is a feature of positive externalities. Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to do this positive externality question. This is the free response question that related to Head Start. And of course, Head Start is actually a subsidized government program, so it's more of a public sector than a private sector thing. But let's just kind of imagine that we're talking about a pre-K program that's run by the private sector. And very much like the last question, you would really want to start off by just graphing the actual market for this particular product, which is, say, the number of seats or available seats in a pre-K program. And there's a quantity in the market. So there's a quantity for the market, you have a demand curve, you have a supply curve, and we have a price for this particular good in the market. And remember from the last video that we're really looking at our supply curve as the same thing as our marginal cost. And in this case, because we're looking at pre-K education as a positive externality, not as a negative externality, we really don't have any issues with our supply curve. And to make it clear, we could note that our marginal private costs are really the same as our marginal social costs, okay? So for our purposes, the data that's reflected on the current supply curve is just fine. Where we have a particular discrepancy, however, is in the marginal private benefit and the marginal social benefit. So the demand curve for the market is really the same thing as the marginal private benefit. So there are consumers who at the current price are actually consuming, daycare for their kids and paying the money to send their kids to, pre-K rather, and they are not necessarily realizing the social benefits of their kids going to pre-K. And society, of course, would like to see a greater amount of any type of positive externality. So we're just going to graph the demand curve here and note this is really your marginal social benefit. And the effective curve is really the marginal private benefit. This is the quantity that the market's producing, but we could note this is really the quantity of, spots in Head Start that society would really like to see, okay? So again, we have a gap between the quantity in the market and the quantity in the kind of what's socially optimal or allocatively efficient, and it's this quantity that society does indeed want to see, and what makes this a problem situation. What we'd like to do is try to move the market quantity a lot closer to the quantity that society wants to see, okay? We know this is a market failure. That was one of the questions at hand for a couple of reasons. One is the market isn't producing the socially optimal quantity. Use the language of either socially optimal or allocatively efficient, or the market quantity is less than the socially optimal quantity, okay? So noting that, you also have deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is going to be right here, okay? This spot right here, that's deadweight loss, okay? So we have a situation where because of this gap in quantity, because we're not at the socially optimal level, we have deadweight loss. Then your positive externality will always be a situation of inefficiency, and we know that because there's deadweight loss, which is another reason we know it's a market failure. The next few questions actually kind of had some similarities to them. if the government developed additional Head Start programs around the nation and they were subsidized. So imagine some folks on the supply curve area, on the producer side rather, were subsidized. What would happen? And the thing is with positive externalities, we generally know we want to subsidize, right? We want to make it easier for this good to be produced, and we want to make it easier for this good to be purchased or consumed in the market. So it really doesn't matter whether we subsidize producers or we subsidize consumers. The effect is essentially the same. So in the first question, which I think is E, if I actually subsidize the producers, what happens, right? Even though my supply curve isn't really depicting an externality issue, I can still shift my supply curve and create a new market equilibrium. So I shift my supply curve in the case of a subsidy, and if I subsidize enough, what happens to my supply curve? My new supply curve is this supply curve plus the subsidy. You actually have a greater quantity of Head Start programs out there. My marginal private benefit curve is still the active demand curve, right? It's the effective demand curve. We haven't done anything to the demand curve to increase toward the marginal social benefit, but that increase in supply enabled a lower price, which enabled more people to access pre-K, which enabled the quantity that's socially optimal. So if it's easier to subsidize producers, by all means do it, right? Ultimately, we get the socially optimal quantity, and your market quantity and your socially optimal quantity would essentially be the same, okay? Looking at kind of the issue of quantity socially optimal for the externality, but then kind of looking at this as a new market equilibrium. You'd have a new price and you'd have a new market quantity. And again, no deadweight loss. If you actually said, well, we're not going to give producers anything in terms of subsidy, the more like typical way of correcting or internalizing this externality would be to give money to consumers. So subsidize families, maybe by eligibility criteria or whichever, who ultimately can then access seats for free in some of the child care centers or pre-K centers. In that case, it would be very similar to the tax issue in the past, negative externality. You'd be pushing your marginal private benefit curve into your marginal social benefit curve. So if you didn't subsidize here and your socially optimal, was still at this quantity, you could push your demand curve here, and then you'd have a new equilibrium of your quantity socially optimal. So you can do subsidy this way, supply or demand, and your effect is increasing the quantity. Shift supply right, you increase the quantity. Shift demand right, you increase quantity, and that's exactly what you want to happen for a positive externality. You want greater quantity, and kind of who loses out and benefits or whatever can vary a little bit. So you can get into discussions related to kind of the balance of the welfare exchanges, who benefits and loses, because we know that subsidies also have their own kind of inherent issues. But in this case, we're looking at this type of subsidy, a Pigouvian subsidy, as erasing deadweight loss, okay? And one last part of this was, what if the government actually created a mandate that suggested all kids had to go to pre-K, which is something that's talked about all the time. New York City is currently looking at that. We know there's a lot of advantages, and there's a couple of different answers you could have put for this. It's very possible, if every kid was going to go to pre-K, that perhaps the quantity that would be mandatory might include lots and lots of people. And even though lots of people might receive a great amount of marginal benefit, some people might already be paying for pre-K, and ultimately it's possible that the quantity could be above socially optimal and your marginal cost could be greater than your marginal benefit, and possibly it could lead to additional deadweight loss. If you are not at the socially optimal quantity, it doesn't matter whether you're under or you're over, you would have deadweight loss. So mandating every kid to go to pre-K could actually kind of create a quantity of seats way beyond the socially optimal quantity. At the same time, perhaps the externality is much, much, much bigger than the way I depicted it here, and maybe the positive externality is really maximized when all kids or certain groups of kids, are able to experience pre-K. So maybe there are particular advantages to society if every kid goes, and that's inherently part of the positive externality, in which case, you might have this social benefit curve just be so far away that if every kid went, you would be actually closer to socially optimal. And then finally, you could kind of, look at that issue also. This graph depicts efficiency. So even if you created a system where every kid had to go to pre-K and there was some additional deadweight loss here, that you were over the quantity that was socially optimal, it's perfectly fine to also make an argument to say there can be equity issues that sometimes run amok of efficiency issues. So sometimes economics and whether something is efficient or not, it's not the only piece to the puzzle. Sometimes there's other arguments as well, political considerations, things like that. So lots of ways in which, for equity purposes, it could be advantageous for a mandatory law like that. Okie doke, I hope that was helpful. If you have questions, continue to let me know, but really work on making sure that you can graph, find the deadweight loss, and work through Pigouvian taxes and subsidies. Of course, if you were to tax a situation like this, you would be doing the opposite and have an impact that was creating, less and less pre-K, something that you wouldn't necessarily want to do. Okie doke, have a good rest of the weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.
Could we stop having fun with this?